Police intimidate a homeless black veteran he calls the Pentagon and ruins their careers. He showed up at the same time every day, between 9 and 10 in the morning. A shabby olive green military jacket, slow steps, a little plastic bag of counted coins in his pocket. Damian Tavvaris never hurried, never rushed. He'd sit in the corner of the Horizonte coffee shop by the window, where the light fell in a way that seemed to resurrect pieces of memory. He ordered the same coffee, always a small black, and held it with both gloved hands as if it were an anchor. Outside, the city moved at breakneck speed. People rushing, car horns blaring, baristas calling out the wrong names. Inside Horizonte, nobody noticed him. Maybe they thought he was part of the furniture, an old soldier too tired to cause trouble, invisible enough not to raise questions. What nobody knew was that this seemingly broken man carried more stories than any book on the shelves of that street. But that morning, everything changed. Outside, a patrol car pulled up. 2 officers watched through the windshield. One of them, older, with eyes trained to distrust, nodded toward the door. A man in a military jacket, stubble on his face, head down. A figure that, to him, spelled trouble. Inside the cafe, Damian still cradled his cup. The coffee's warmth was faint, but enough to feign comfort. He stared at the street as if searching for something he'd lost and was too afraid to admit. The door opened. The bell jingled again, but this time the sound was different, colder, harder. The 2 officers entered as if they already knew how the scene would end. Some customers glanced over, others just looked down. Damian felt their footsteps before he saw them. He didn't need to turn around to understand. They hadn't come in peace. They stood before him, didn't ask permission, didn't ask his name. One of them grabbed his jacket, turned up the inside flap, examined the hand-stitched serial number. The other crossed his arms and said he'd have to come with them. For safety, they said. Standard procedure. But nobody there saw any threat. None. What they saw was a man being handcuffed for wearing his own history. Damian didn't shout, didn't complain, didn't even plead. He just stood up calmly, as if he'd been expecting this. He glanced out the window one last time, the same view as always, the street, the cars, the hurried people. And before he left, he spoke softly. "I need to make a call." The reply was curt. "You'll have time for that at the station." The woman 2 tables over muttered something nobody heard. Later, she'd tell the manager, "He reminds me of my brother. He served, too, and he was forgotten." The door clicked shut behind him. Outside, the cold cut deeper, but it wasn't the weather. It was the silence. Inside the patrol car, the younger officer peeked in the rearview mirror. He met Damian's serene eyes and hesitated for a moment. Something about that image felt out of place. The stubble, the patched jacket, the gaze that asked for nothing yet carried everything. The man didn't look like a liar or a fraud. He looked tired, but whole. And that's when the doubt crept in. Small, uncomfortable. What if he's telling the truth? Damian didn't answer. He just smiled, a faint, almost imperceptible smile, and said, "When you call, you'll understand." The city kept racing by outside, but something, that morning, had stopped for good. It was only the beginning. The North Sector precinct was built of aging concrete, cold walls and hurried voices. People coming and going, paperwork, phones that never stopped ringing. For some, this was routine. For Damian Tavvaris, it was just another room where he would be forgotten. Sitting in silence, handcuffed, he seemed too calm for someone under arrest. Not because he was at peace, but because he already knew what it felt like to be judged before he was heard. The older officer, Aranda, rushed through his report. He didn't look at Damian, didn't want to. He just wanted to fill out the form, follow protocol, keep the world how he understood it. The younger, Nevs, couldn't stop staring. Something gnawed at him, a discomfort that had grown since the moment he'd snapped on those handcuffs. Damian didn't react. He just looked around as if he'd been there before and survived. "I want to make a call," he said without raising his voice. Aranda laughed. "Who you gonna call? Your imaginary lawyer?" Damian didn't answer right away. He looked at the handcuffs, then at the wall phone. And with a tone free of anger but full of certainty, he said, "I'm calling a man who owes me his life." Neves, wordless, handed him the phone. By impulse, by instinct. Damian dialed without hesitation. Each digit seemed tattooed in his memory, as if his fingers knew the sequence by heart. 3 rings, 4. A voice answered, "Office of General David Keller." Silence, long. "Sergeant Damian Tavvaris speaking. Code 21A17. I need to speak with him. Urgent." The operator froze. Her tone shifted. 1 moment. Seconds later, another voice came on the line, deeper, more authoritative. "Damian? Where are you?" "North Sector Precinct. In custody for wearing my own jacket." The pause was brief, almost military. "Stay where you are. Don't talk to anyone else. I'm on my way." The line went dead. Damian replaced the handset with calm. He looked at Aranda, who now feigned disinterest, and at Neves, who was ashen. "You might want to make a call too," he said evenly. "What's coming isn't small." The clock on the wall read 10:12. 40 minutes later, 3 black cars pulled up outside the precinct. Men in dark suits, sunglasses, and metal badges crossed the lobby as if they already knew where to go. The receptionist knocked over her coffee mug at the sight of the symbol around one man's neck, military intelligence. The precinct captain, flustered, approached in person. "May we know the reason for your visit?" The man didn't smile. He simply said, "We're here to retrieve Sergeant Damian Tavvaris by direct order of General Keller, and we expect a full report on his detention by the end of the day." The institutional world of the precinct trembled. Inside the interview room, Aranda was still with Damian. The phone hadn't rung again, but Aranda already sensed the shift in the air. When the door opened, it wasn't rushed, nor shouted. It was authoritative. The precinct captain entered, flanked by the intelligence officer. Damian rose, still in cuffs. "Sergeant Tavvaris," said the captain, using his rank as if apologizing. "You're to come with us." Aranda said nothing. Neves looked down. As he left the room, Damian paused in the doorway. He looked at the 2 officers for a second, not with bitterness, but with the serenity of someone who's seen humanity's worst and still chooses not to mirror it. "Thank you for not listening to me," he said, "because now everyone will have to." And he walked out, uncuffed, unhurried, without looking back. The military hospital smelled of disinfectant and silence. It was clean, bright, cold. Damian walked the halls like someone revisiting a past he'd sworn to forget. Uniformed soldiers stepped aside as he passed. Others just stared, either failing to recognize him or unable to believe what they were seeing. His name was still in the archives, but it had long since been wiped from view. Now he was back, and the system didn't quite know what to do with him. General David Keller waited at attention beside a nurse. No handshake, no speech. Just a long, meaningful look, one of those looks that says, "I should have reached out sooner." Damian didn't need words. He already knew. While Damian was being examined in the El Encino Base Medical Center, his story was being unlocked in buried computer files, folders, and reports. Special Operations Sergeant, 17 years of active duty, advanced training in survival, infiltration, and extraction. Deployments in the Middle East, North Africa, Central America. Awards: Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Meritorious Service Medal. A spotless record, except for classified missions nobody talked about. But it was 2015, during an operation almost no one knew about, that his life changed forever. An ambush in Afghanistan, a platoon pinned down by insurgents. The mission was too covert to call for formal backup. Damian led the withdrawal alone, covering the rear for over 4 hours. He was wounded twice but never faltered. He saved every last man, including David Keller, then just a colonel. He never spoke of it. Not once. Maybe because he never expected anything in return. Or maybe because deep down he knew nobody would listen anyway. After that final firefight, Damian came home, but the country he'd defended with his body wasn't ready to welcome him back with his soul intact. No support, no counseling, no transition program. He was shoved into oblivion with the same efficiency he'd been trained to kill. First, he lost his job, then his apartment. His wife couldn't handle the war ghost he had become and took the kids with her. The hero became a statistic. He slept in shelters, sometimes on the street. He shuffled between libraries and coffee shops, pretending to have a routine. The military jacket was the only thing left from his old life, and he wore it every single day. Not out of pride, but so he wouldn't forget he once mattered. In the hospital, Nurse Lucia cleaned an old wound on his shoulder, a deep, crooked scar, hastily stitched in a battlefield field hospital. "How did this never get proper treatment?" she murmured, more to herself than to him. Damian didn't answer. He just took a deep breath, as someone who's carried pain so long he barely feels it anymore. Next door, General Keller spoke on the phone with headquarters. "He saved my life. He saved dozens of lives, then we threw him out on the street. If this doesn't shame us, we're part of the problem." Hours later, Damian left the hospital. No honor guard, no reporters, just a plain car waiting outside. In the back seat, an envelope. Inside, every medal he'd never bothered to claim, and a handwritten note. "This was never forgotten. We forgot you. Forgive me. Keller." Damian didn't cry, but for a moment he held the envelope tight against his chest, like it was the first gift the world had given him in years. Back at the North Sector precinct, the fallout was still rolling in. Officer Aranda was suspended pending investigation. Neves stayed silent. Since Damian walked out, he hadn't said a word. The weight of the real story had finally hit everyone, the gap between what they saw and what they refused to see. Downtown, the Horizonte Cafe opened as usual the next morning. Damian didn't show up, but the manager set aside a coffee at his table. Next to it, a note, "On the house if you come back. This time, we want to listen." No newspapers ran the story. No headlines blared. "War hero wrongfully arrested." No cameras scrambled to capture it. Damian Tavvaris' story was being stitched back together in the same silence that tore it apart. But behind the scenes in the military, something moved. And this time, it wasn't to bury the truth, but to rebuild. Damian spent the following days in El Encino's medical center. Among the sterile corridors and professional voices, he was called by the rank he'd never asked for again, Sergeant Tavvaris. He didn't look comfortable, not because he didn't deserve it, but because he knew what that title had cost him. Nurse Lucia was the only one who didn't treat him like a hero. Maybe that's why he let her get close. "You need to rest more," she said. "I've already rested too much on the streets, nurse." She understood and didn't push further. In General Keller's office, meetings ran back-to-back. Officers, advisors, veterans, advocates, everyone trying to figure out how a man like Damian slipped off the radar for so long. "He didn't slip away. We just looked the other way," Keller said resolutely. That's when they unveiled a new initiative, a national reintegration center for homeless veterans, offering psychological support, safe housing, a listening ear, and above all, dignity. And at the heart of the proposal was one name, not as a symbol, but as its very foundation, Damian Tavvaris. When the general pitched it to him, Damian replied quickly, I don't want my face in a campaign. I don't want to be used." "Then tell us what you do want." He took a breath. "I want nobody else to live what I lived, to wander the way I walked, unseen." Meanwhile, changes were already underway. The North Sector Precinct Captain was forced to revise its arrest protocols. Aranda was officially removed for misconduct, and Neves wrote a letter, not because he had to, but because ever since that day something inside him wouldn't let him sleep. The letter didn't beg forgiveness. It simply read, "I never saw him because no one ever taught me to see. But now I carry that burden, and I will turn it into duty. You don't know me, but you changed me. Thank you." Damian read it in silence, folded it carefully, and tucked it into the pocket of that same jacket, the one that nearly put him behind bars. Days later, he was invited to tour the Future Center's building, an empty, broken-down structure with shattered windows and peeling paint. Damian walked the abandoned halls like someone surveying war ruins. He pointed to a small room at the back. "This could be the first listening room," he said, "with natural light. A simple table. Nothing institutional, just human. What do you want to call this place?" they asked. He paused, recalling the unseen roots that kept him standing when he was buried alive. "Call it Roots Center." That night he returned to his hospital room. He lay down slowly, aligned his boots beside the bed as he always did, folded his jacket with care, sat at the bedside and stared at the blank wall for a long time. No tears, just deep breaths. The wounds no longer screamed, but they were still there. Only now they weren't his alone. The next day, Damian Tavvaris would re-enter the world, not as a soldier nor as a victim, but as a bridge for all those still invisible. And gradually, the world would start to listen. The building still smelled of fresh paint and restless promise. Centro Raíces had opened its doors without ceremony, without ribbon-cutting speeches, without a red ribbon. Just a simple sign at the entrance. Here, nobody needs to justify their existence. Coffee was served from a thermos. The chairs had been donated. The hallways were still bare of furniture, but full of anticipation. And there was Damian Tavvaris, jacket folded over his forearm, steady steps, watchful eyes. No name badge, no official title. He didn't want to be called director. He preferred to be called by his name, or by nothing, just presence. The first to arrive was Travis, thin, restless, still caked in street dust, and a guilt no shower could wash away. He sat in the corner of the listening room and didn't speak for 42 minutes. Damian didn't either. He sat nearby, in another chair, and simply sat there. No questions, no pitying looks, just breathing together, waiting. On the 43rd minute, Travis said, "Do you dream about what you saw too?" Damian answered with the silence of someone who's had to scream inside just to keep living on the outside. Travis understood, and he kept coming back. On day 1, he stayed an hour. On day 2, he brought a drawing. On day 3, he cried, but for the first time, he cried without hiding. Miguel arrived weeks later, sunken eyes, thick beard, a face hardened by abandonment. He walked in without greeting anyone, sat by the window and stared out at the street. He didn't ask for anything, didn't accept coffee, but he stayed. On the 3rd day he said, "I only came because it hurts more out there." Damian replied, "It hurts in here too, but at least we don't have to pretend we don't feel it." Miguel didn't smile, but he came back the next day, and the next, and the next. Little by little, Centro Raíces stopped being just a building. It became a refuge. Some came for the food, others for a clean bathroom, but most came because, for the first time in years, someone called them by name, not bum, not lost cause, not ex-soldier, just by their name. Damian moved among them without looking down from above. He didn't cast himself as a savior. He stood beside them, like a mirror. Sometimes he'd simply say, "I'm here if you want to talk." And usually that was enough. Because there's a truth few understand. Not everyone wants help, but everyone needs to be heard. One night, Travis had a breakdown. He yelled, kicked chairs, locked himself in the bathroom. Volunteers wanted to call the police. Damian said no. He sat outside the door for 3 hours. No banging, no forcing, just talking. I thought the world wanted to lock me up too, but sometimes it's just the past, trying to scream its way out. When Travis opened the door, his eyes were red, but his breathing was different. That night, he slept at the center. The next morning, he asked to help with the cleanup. Meanwhile, in the project review meetings, the numbers were still small. Few served, few results. "We need more metrics," said one manager. "What he does can't even be quantified," said Lucia, now the project's mediator. "Then how do we know if it's working?" She answered, "Because for the first time, people are coming back. People who never come back." Damian refused interviews, photos, tributes. The only thing he agreed to was a phrase painted on the listening room wall: "Dignity doesn't shout, you carry it." Some changes make no noise. They don't hit the news. They don't earn applause. They happen slowly, underground, like roots pushing through concrete. That's how what many would later call the Tavvaris effect began. At the North Sector precinct, the corridors still recalled the morning Damian walked out in handcuffs. But now, something was different. On the training room bulletin board, a new directive circulated among cadets: approach procedure, Tavvaris manual. A simple booklet, but with a revolutionary core: approach as one seeking truth, not assuming guilt. The content was crafted by a new group inside the force, led by someone unexpected, Officer Neves. Since the day he read Damian's letter, Neves plunged into everything he could find on approaches: active listening, de-escalation. He started visiting Centro Raízes in plain clothes. At first, just to observe, then to learn. Damian never commented on his presence, but he never ignored him either. On his third visit, Neves asked, "How did you manage not to hate us?" Damian replied without hurry, "Because I was trained to hate, and it cost me dearly to get out of that." Meanwhile, Centro Raízes grew stronger. Travis was now a regular volunteer. Miguel spent more time helping than complaining. Others began to arrive, and most importantly, they began to return. People who'd lost faith even with their own families. Those who never finished treatment, veterans who'd been through 10 shelters without forming a bond. At Raízes, there were no targets. There was listening. Damian's influence caught the attention of the military high command. He was invited to a panel on veteran reintegration in Washington. He declined the trip. He sent a letter, read live by General Keller. Its words became a headline in internal forums. "What a veteran needs isn't charity. It's humanity. Don't give us applause. Give us your ears. Where listening enters, suicide recedes." Tavvaris. The phrase spread through universities, police academies, clinics. It was printed on posters, painted on murals. But Damian remained silent. One day, a box arrived at the Raízes headquarters. Inside was the Bronze Star, his highest decoration, officially issued by the Army, nearly 10 years late. He thanked them, and that same day, he nailed it to the listening room wall. No frame, no glass, just the medal set into the chipped plaster. Below it, a note: "This medal is yours if it reminds you that you can start again." That same night, Neves gave his first lecture as a guest instructor at the police academy. He brought only one photo, a grainy still from the Horizonte Cafe's security camera months before. In it, Damian sat handcuffed, gazing out the window. Neves pointed to the image and said, "This was the worst mistake of my career and the start of my transformation. Today I teach this because this man taught me without saying a word." There was no stage for Damian, but his presence was felt in the details. In the new protocol, in the hot coffee served at the centers, in the extra chair placed in interview rooms, in the pause before judgment in a guard's gaze, the world still hadn't recognized him publicly. But it was beginning, slowly, to recognize him within. Damian Tavvaris never set out to be heard by many. All he needed was to be heard by one, so long as that one was really ready to listen. What he didn't know was that he was planting echoes, seeds, invisible bridges between shared wounds. At Centro Raíces, the former sergeant was more than a counselor. He became a trainer. He taught new listeners, not with handouts but with his presence, that the hardest part of listening isn't figuring out what to say. It's staying when someone else is falling apart. Among his trainees was Lydia, a psychiatric hospital nurse who met Damian in one of those silent listening circles and has never treated her patients the same way again. There was also Ottavio, a former addict who now brings books and conversation circles to shelters, inspired by Damian's quiet, steady approach. And of course Travis, who used to shake whenever he talked, now leads veteran support groups with a confidence he never knew he had. He never gave me direct advice, Travis says. He just listened in a way that made me want to be better. Miguel, the most guarded of them all, now visits military prisons every month, not as an expert, but as a survivor. If they don't listen to you in here, you'll carry it all outside, he tells inmates. Out there, nobody has patience for someone who suddenly explodes. It's tough and to the point, but it works. Damian watched with respectful distance. Proud, yes, but still low-key. He still folded his jacket just so, still washed his own coffee mug, still arrived early and left late. When a national reporter begged him to share his story on TV, he refused. "The story's already being told," he said, "just not with words." At the North Sector precinct, they even built a tiny, modest room, the Tavvaris listening room. Before any suspect is interrogated, they go through an active listening protocol. Violence rates dropped, recidivism fell. A system used to rushing finally grasped the power of a pause. He was invited to an international veterans policy conference in Washington. He declined again. "If you want to hear me, come to Centro Raíces," he said. "Here, the talk smells like coffee and stiff chairs. Out there, it's a stage." Some came, delegations, researchers, commanders, expecting a speech. They left in silence, stunned to realize the real impact wasn't in what Damian said, but in what he let others say. One afternoon, he sat with Officer Neves in the back of the center, drinking thermos coffee as usual. Neves said, "I never formally apologized to you." Damian just looked at him, calm. "The form doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what you do next." Silence. Coffee. Presence. Gradually, Damian handed the center over to others, not because he was tired, but because he knew the best legacy is one that no longer depends on its creator. One ordinary morning at Centro Raíces, hot coffee brewing, Travis sweeping the patio, Miguel reading by the window, Lydia leading a listening circle, they noticed Damian was gone. No note, no explanation, and yet no panic. Anyone who knows Damian knows. He never left a place without leaving something behind. On his desk lay a carefully folded note. Next to it, his old military jacket, spotless, folded with military precision, and on top of the jacket, his bronze star. No frame, no glass, just the medal. The note read, "If you listen with your heart, they'll know they can come home. I haven't gone away. I've just stepped aside. Now it's up to you. D." The paper passed from hand to hand. Some wept, others smiled, but nobody searched for him because they understood. Damian hadn't fled. He'd set them free. In the days that followed, Centro Raíces kept running, no stumbles, no stops. Travis took over the morning listening sessions. Lydia coordinated training for new counselors. Miguel organized donations. And Damian's name? It didn't become a statue, it didn't become a holiday. It became a method of presence, of listening, of non-judgmental care. His jacket still hangs by the entrance with a simple sign: if it's too cold, wear it, but only if it reminds you who you are. Quietly, Damian became what he always was: a bridge between pain and dignity, between war and silence, between abandonment and belonging. Elsewhere in town, Neves walked into a police academy carrying a binder labeled Tavvaris Manual. In his pocket, he kept a copy of that note and read it before every class, just to remember why he was there. Damian never wanted recognition, yet his story spread in hushed voices, in small circles, in centers like Raizes, in makeshift shelters, in police training rooms, in families who almost lost their veterans and didn't, because someone listened with their heart. What remains of Damian Tavvaris? Nothing you can see, but everything you need, because sometimes the most important person is the one you never realized saved you, and it all started with a jacket and a look that refused to stop existing. If this story moved you, tell me in the comments who taught you to truly listen. Leave a like, not for me, but for all the Damians still invisible out there. And subscribe, because stories like this need to keep being heard.